Well, Oklahoma and Arizona passed legislation to protect women's sport.
And apparently people have decided that because I don't think that post-operative transgender men, i.e. M2F,
this does mean that a society that seeks to propagandize to children that they can switch their gender is both lying to
advocates protecting children and author of Desist,
Well, Tracy, the question is, should minors, I'm talking about 12 to 16-year-olds, be allowed to have sex change operations or even be pestered by healthcare providers to change their identity?
Inner cells, and those inner cells are sexed,
implementing these policies, not only is it unconstitutional, but it's extremely dangerous. It could lead to
Hi, Grandpa here. I haven't finished the actual costumes for the video I originally intended to make now. It'll be out someday, sometime, you know how it is. But speaking of Felsons, let's stop talking about me and talk about, you know, the massive increase of anti-LGBTQ propaganda and the numerous efforts of criminalizing reproductive health, by which I mean abortion, and the existence of queer people. I usually, that sounded like Elon Musk. I usually shy away from very concrete political topics because I feel like there's a lot of people out there who already cover those things and do that much better and much more entertaining than I can. But while the people generally do a pretty good job in talking about American think tanks and other billionaire and multimillionaire losers who can bear the thought of being a little less rich, a little less powerful, or measly little peasants living their life in a way that these billionaires don't like, I suppose. They tend to not focus on the fact that these institutions actually act globally. As an example, the American Center for Law and Justice, which is run and founded by the Sekulow family, has a European offshoot called the Slavic Center for Law and Justice in Moscow. The Sekulow family has had a direct link to the Trump administration. I believe Jay Sekulow was his lawyer, and the head and founder of the Slavic Center for Law and Justice is part of Russia's Human Rights Council, which has direct links to the Kremlin and, as such, Putin. According to Open Democracy, the Slavic Center for Law and Justice was involved in Poland's ruling to strip women of their bodily autonomy. Open Democracy calls the money going into and out of these charities, and yes, I have to remind you that these crapshoots are legally charities, dark money, and rightfully so. Very often we have very little idea of who spends how much money and on what they're spending it on. Of course, there are some people that are a little less shameless, like the Koch family or the Koch Foundation, or the DeVos family or the DeVos Foundation, you know how it is. But a lot of the money goes through other foundations that allows the givers to remain anonymous. But, you know, sometimes we are given a gift so great that it's hard to put into words. In August of 2021, WikiLeaks released an astounding 17,000 documents from one of those organizations, which allows us a pretty unprecedented look into the operations and finances of organizations like that. The organization they acquired these documents from is called CitizenGo. So, with the pretext out of the way, what is CitizenGo? CitizenGo was founded in 2013 as kind of the international offshoot of HDOR, which in turn was founded in 2001. Both of these organizations were founded by Ignacio Arzuaga. And Arzuaga is actually the nephew of Spain's former vice president and former head of the International Monetary Fund, Rodrigo Rato. Both Rodrigo Rato as well as the party he was a part of, the PP, would later be sentenced for financial crimes. Weird. What is it with conservative parties and financial crimes, I wonder out loud? Oh, Rato also was featured in the Panama Papers. You know, remember those? Where we learned who is evading millions in taxes? Keep that in mind. Rodrigo Rato and by extension Arzuaga were born into a pretty rich family. Rodrigo's father, Ramon Rato, was pretty successful during the Franco dictatorship in Spain. While Ramon was a monarchist himself, he wasn't exactly opposed to the Franco dictatorship either. As a little bonus, he too was found guilty in 1967 of financial crimes. Weird. And I shit you not, Ramon is actually the grandson of Faustino Rodriguez San Pedro, who was a colonial ruler in Cuba during the Independence War. I swear to God, the more I realize that a bunch of rich people and assholes today are actually familiarly related to historically pretty questionable people, the more I lose my sanity. But back to the present, CitizenGo is active on 3 continents, in over 50 countries, and has offices in at least 15. CitizenGo is the 6th largest sponsor of LGBTQ hate and misogyny in Europe. And while I have no doubt that his family's background essentially enabled Arzuaga to basically shitpost all day instead of getting a real job after attending university in the United States, he seems to still be reliant on like-minded but richer losers. While CitizenGo does receive thousands of smaller donations, they internally identified about 800 large donors and around 200 great donors, or mega donors, I guess you would call them. Among these gracious givers, who gave a couple thousand euros each, are David Alvarez Diaz, founder of the Yulin Group conglomerate, Esther Koplowitz, board member of her father's billion-dollar construction conglomerate, FCC, and a little fun fact, Carlos Slim actually became a shareholder of that company. Remember that name. Isidoro Alvarez, former president of El Corte Inglés, a department store chain which was a colonial enterprise at its inception. Juan Miguel Villamir, Spanish billionaire, former Minister of Finance and CEO of construction company OHL, and Bernard Meunier, who has been a part of Nestle for a couple of decades now. Not to be confused with the French chemist of the same name, which, as far as I know, has nothing to do with all this. Just, you know, the dude who's with Nestle. Okay. These were the largest donors identified for 2012 when Arzuaga was planning to launch CitizenGo, basically. And according to himself, they still fell short of their funding goal. Because of that, Arzuaga approached Russian multimillionaire Konstantin Malofeev for additional funding. Malofeev, a monarchist himself, is the chairman of the St. Basil the Great Foundation, which is the 5th largest sponsor of LGBTQ hate and misogyny in Europe. He's also the founder and owner of Zaga TV, a Russian propaganda network in the image of Fox News, for which he had actually hired one of Fox News' former producers. Malofeev allegedly has close links to the Russian Orthodox Church and allegedly again is funding separatists in Ukraine. In 2012 he ran for office in Smolensk Oblast and he won that election even though the Vyazim Regional Court had ruled that he was guilty of bribing potential voters to vote for him, promising them 500 rubles each. What a charming guy. Another white Russian involved with CitizenGo is Vladimir Yakunin, multimillionaire or billionaire what does it matter actually, who is the former president of Russian Railways, and just like Malofeev, allegedly has pretty good links to Putin, as well as separatists in Ukraine. He's involved in the Stocky Endowment Fund, which is the third largest sponsor of LGBTQ hate and misogyny in Europe, as well as Dialogue of Civilizations, 11th largest sponsor in Europe, and St. Andrew I called. One of the board members of Dialogue of Civilizations is the German aristocrat Gloria von Thurn and Taxis, which is one of the more prominent members of the aristocratic and clerical elite in the German-speaking parts of Europe that espouses these kind of racist, homophobic, transphobic, and anti-abortion propaganda. As I've said, both Yakunin and Malofeev have been accused of funding separatism in Ukraine, which is why both are under international sanctions. That's probably why, the sanctions part, why journalists tend to focus on these two lovely fellas when it comes to the funding of CitizenGo. And now, you know, I like Russian millionaires and billionaires as much as the next guy, okay? But, you know, I'd appreciate a little more coverage of the other people involved, because I personally, at least, don't really care whether it's a Russian billionaire who wants to exterminate me or a Spanish one. Does it make a difference? I don't know. I guess legally it does, but for me personally, not really. While the sanctions part is pretty spicy, the funding from Russia for these kind of organizations are still dwarfed by the European funders overall in total amount. And well, before I move on from billionaires and millionaires, there's one other person that I think should be mentioned in the context of CitizenGo and, you know, homophobia and misogyny in general. And that name is Patricio Slim. Patricio Slim is a Mexican billionaire. And as you surely remember, another member of the Slims is actually a relatively big shareholder of FCC. Now, to be fair, George Soros also is a shareholder of FCC, but to be even fairer, much less so than Carlos Slim. Anyway, the Slims are the richest family in Mexico and one of the richest families in the entire world. While Patricio Slim seems to try to stay out of the limelight, he's a notorious funder of efforts to recriminalize abortion in Mexico. And as it seems, around the world, really. CitizenGo's launch would not have been possible if it weren't for what Neil Dutta refers to as the 1%'s reactionary activism. But since they publicly so strongly pride themselves in the smaller contributions so many people make to them, why don't we take a look at that? According to the EPF report, CitizenGo's funding model is in part inspired by and based on the funding model deployed and developed, I guess, by Tradition Family Property, which is the second largest sponsor of this hatred in Europe. They describe it as follows. The TFP fundraising system is based on generating extensive databases of potential donors and pushing Catholic-themed gadgets through mass mailing. To generate the databases, TFP members create petitions on a range of social issues, usually politicizing issues to generate social indignation. TFP members are like a chameleon, with several coexisting within the same country, but bearing different names, focus, and branding, giving the impression of separate, unrelated organizations. However, these TFP organizations share the same leadership. This allows TFP affiliates to run several campaigns simultaneously. For example, one on abortion, another one on pornography, and a third on traditional Catholic rituals. The signatories to the petitions thus provide the first dataset of supporters, which can be moved to become potential donors. The second step includes targeting the signatories with requests for financial support and mass mailing unsolicited low-cost Catholic-themed paraphernalia, such as rosaries or miraculous medals or TFP literature. This enables TFP to start generating untaxed revenue. Then, TFP organizations exchange datasets so that each may target the signatories of the other's petitions. Therefore, a person who signed one petition may feature on the recipient list of several TFP organizations, each one requesting support for its specific cause. In the end, the potential donors believe that they are supporting several unrelated organizations rather than the same TFP network. The TFP network has used this fundraising model since its origins in Brazil in the 1960s. However, the US Christian right conservative fundraiser Bruce Ebeler, who pioneered the system with a direct fundraising manual, serves as the inspiration for its modern version. Ebeler boasts the benefits of his model, that unlike if you spend money on advertising, the recipients of your mail pay. Ebeler, a visiting professor at the Leadership Institute, teamed up with European TFP affiliates and has their oar to organize a series of fundraising workshops in Europe. Now, CitizenGo is also a petition platform, which is loosely modeled on change.org according to themselves. But that's not a coincidence, as the former section already alluded to. CitizenGo franchised its model across Europe and Latin America by proposing cooperation agreements with other socially conservative actors, where it, quote, will offer related organizations completely free of charge the most advanced technological tools so that they can influence decision makers, politicians, businessmen, media, and increase their social base and therefore their mobilization capacity by sharing with them the personal data of active citizens who join the campaigns. Let me reiterate that for dramatic effect, I suppose. All of the personal data that you give them by signing a petition, you name your address, the amount you donated, when you signed, when you donated, what you signed, and probably much, much more that I can't even imagine. All of that personal data they share with anyone that is politically aligned with them and has a cooperation agreement with them. To continue quoting the report, as Perez Colome explains, Hasder uses one of the most sophisticated and expensive marketing tools in the world, Marketo. It allows each user to write according to their activity and isolate groups of thousands of people according to their interests: education, abortion, gays, their tendency to donate, their desire to support petitions. Marketo automates itineraries so that those people receive more tailored messages. It's the gold mining of marketing. This approach allowed CitizenGo and Hasder to generate $32.7 million between 2009 and 2018. Ah yes, surveillance capitalism and hate speech, a match made in hell. It is this wealth of data that, in my opinion, allows them to not only notify you of other petitions you might be interested in with related topics, but actually change messages to get you to support them or donate money based on how these automation tools believe how appealing they're going to be for you specifically. Another pillar to get people into this hate speech funnel in the first place is CitizenGo's publicity stance, which, according to themselves, was inspired by Greenpeace. One such product that made the rounds relatively recently, I believe, I'm not totally sure. One of those things was the free speech bus that was seen around the world, I'm pretty sure. And this free speech bus had these heavily prosecuted statements on them, like boys have penises. Oh boy, that's like right next to the 1-8 in the catalog of prosecuted speech. Woo. Anyway, other hate organizations were able to rent those buses and have them drive around wherever they wanted them to. And I think it's those kind of a little bit, a little spicy, a little edgy political actions in real life that nowadays are of course shared by journalists and social media users that allows them to have a large amount of reach, and the people who agree with them will become aware of their name and maybe even look them up, maybe even sign a petition. And once they sign the petition, jackpot. In my opinion, I'm not studying like marketing and shit. That's just how it sounds like, okay? However, there's one more aspect of their finances, which, to be fair, probably is minor compared to the ones I've talked about before, but we need to talk about this. The Azerbaijani laundromat, or sometimes called the Russo-Azerbaijani laundromat, was a money laundering scheme uncovered by multiple journalists around the world in 2016 and 2017. Between 2012 and 2014, $2.9 billion were laundered through 4 UK-based shell companies as well as the Danske Bank. The companies involved were also involved in the Russian laundromat, hence sometimes it being seen as essentially the same scheme. The majority of money seems to have come from the Aliyev family, which has been the country's dictators since its independence in 1993. The laundered money was given to various European actors who would then write, quote, groundless positive evaluations and articles about Azerbaijan as a nation. While it's hard to say who was explicitly aware that they were receiving laundered money from Azerbaijan and who wasn't, multiple people have been banned from EU buildings for life, and some of them even criminally prosecuted. One of said people was enlightened centrist Luca Volonte. Volonte is an Italian politician, I guess former Italian politician, who was a member of the European Parliament and the actual head of the EVP until 2013. Volonte was sentenced to 4 years in prison for bribery. Yay! Yay! And when the laundromat started to blow up in his face, essentially, Volonte approached multiple of his, quote, friends, and one of them happened to be a man called Ignacio Arzuaga. Multiple of his friends were quite generous. Among the generous, gracious givers were the aforementioned Patricio Slim, as well as US hate preacher Brian Brown, and members of the Vatican. The fucking Vatican. It's unbelievable how well connected these motherfuckers are. According to the EPF's report, 2.39 million euros from the Russo-Azerbaijani laundromat were funneled into the Fondazione Novae Terrae. Volonte was actually the founder of that organization, and that organization would then go on to fund, among others, CitizenGo, of which Volonte was actually a board member of. Also funded with that money was the Dignitates Humanae Institute, which Volonte was the president of and has very close links to Steve Bannon. Now you might be asking yourself, what else is new? I mean, laundered money, who gives a shit? I guess, maybe? Are you asking yourself that? I'm not sure. Anyway, you should care about that, because as you speak English, you're probably aware of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which I think every person with half a brain can agree is bad. However, one conflict that seems to fall under the table, one conflict that doesn't seem to get enough attention, in my opinion, is actually the war between Armenia and Azerbaijan. Now, that conflict has been going on for roughly 100 years. I'll spare you the details. Quite frankly, I don't really know them either, but here's the gist of it. In 2020, a conflict around the contested region Nagorno-Karabakh flared up again after a relatively peaceful period. During those altercations and armed combat, Azerbaijan managed to occupy the entire region, which previously had been occupied by Armenia since the 80s. Now Nagorno-Karabakh, as far as I know, has been formerly Azerbaijani territory since the Soviet Union, but it's territory that had been actually promised to Armenia during negotiations. You know, it's a kind of Turkey-Kurdistan kind of situation to some extent. But in 2021, Azerbaijan actually invaded multiple parts of Armenia that not only had been promised to them, but historically have always been a part of Armenia. And that's kind of concerning because, you know, Armenian genocide and all that.
Another thing I should mention is that while there is some time between the outbreak of the war in 2020 and the run of the laundromat, during the run of the laundromat, the Azerbaijan government actually imprisoned dozens of activists and journalists.
And then, to put the absolute puke-inducing icing on this shit cake, did the EU this year actually decide to further the great partnership with Azerbaijan by importing more of their gas? Because, you know, it's not like there's very clear links between Azerbaijani gas and Gazprom. Yeah, you know, instead of buying Russian gas directly and funding its war against Ukraine directly, why don't we take a couple extra steps to essentially do the same thing? Cool. With laundromats and hate speech pyramids out of the way, it's time to focus on the what. Remember when I mentioned Mexico? Well, I guess this is the section where we go from kind of weird to pretty insane. El Yunque is an alleged secretive, paramilitary, ultra-Catholic, ultra-nationalistic and anti-communist organization in Mexico. The information available in English is pretty limited, although I do have some pretty well-cited articles that will also be linked in the description, my sources of course. But overall, I don't have any good feeling for how believable and credible the information really is. One reason for that is the things that are cited in those articles, even though the articles are in English, the sources they cite are not. So I wouldn't lean myself so far out of the window to say, oh, this is definitely true, you know? But I still wanted to mention it for a couple of reasons. One reason is because the article that led me down this terrible, terrible rabbit hole in the first place talked pretty extensively about El Yunque. The second reason is a lawsuit. In 2010, philosopher Fernando López Luengos was commissioned by the Church of Spain to report on whether and which outside organizations had infiltrated Catholic lay organizations in order to push those organizations towards their own goals. In said report, he apparently linked El Yunque to Hasdewar. And in 2012, Arzuaga sued Luengos over this report. And well, he lost. During the trial, multiple witnesses were called to testify in front of the court whether those allegations were true, whether and which members of Hasdewar were also members of El Yunque. Among those identified were CitizenGo's CEO Álvaro Zulueta, his wife Olga Cucurella, and former campaign manager Luis Lozada. And the judge concluded that all the allegations made by Luengos were, quote, essentially true, and therefore not actionable. According to Open Democracy, CitizenGo then attempted to suppress search results relating to the report and the accusations about its links to El Yunque and other related terms such as far right. Google refused this, over which they also sued. I couldn't find information on how that lawsuit concluded, if it even did conclude, but, you know, free speech. The third reason is that in their leaked documents were also documents advising their members on how to respond to media requests about El Yunque, which is suspicious. Not because it undoubtedly confirms or denies the allegations made against them, but it does show how damaging they think this report and their loss really is. It is of course possible that this document or those documents only exist for some kind of PR damage control, even though the allegations are not true, but, you know, suspicious. Why would I need a document instructing me on how to respond about something which I honestly know nothing about and have no association with? Like, if you ask me what my association is with, I don't know, the World Health Organization, I would just say I don't have any association with them. The fourth reason is that Patricio Slim has also been accused of being a member or somehow involved in El Yunque. The fifth reason is that the alleged association between Hallwylska or CitizenGo and El Yunque is even mentioned in the EPF's report, which is my primary source, as I said. And the last reason is that Europe actually had anti-communist paramilitary organizations, some of which included actual Nazis, because, you know, the Nazis were valuable to the secret services because they were very stark anti-communists. Those organizations had sometimes just ties to the national secret services, but if I remember correctly, a lot of them also had connections to the CIA. Well, I have no idea how El Yunque is seen in Mexico or Spain, and as such can't really grasp how damaging this connection could potentially be. But I do think it's worth mentioning that secret organizations are actually illegal in Spain. So I think, at least in part, that illustrates how risky this situation is for CitizenGo. Well, that's the tinfoil section. I'll actually reuse this tinfoil, just so you know. You know what? Actually, but now let's actually move on to the what, as I've already wanted to. What are they spending their money on? Well, one thing they seem to be spending money on is astroturfing. Astroturfing relates to organizations trying to simulate grassroots movements or grassroots support. And a researcher of the Mozilla Foundation, Odanga Madung, published a report in 2022 about organized campaigns on Twitter which had links to CitizenGo. These campaigns were against two bills in Kenya respectively, the reproductive health care bill as well as the surrogacy bill. According to the report, multiple Kenyans came forward with testimony and proof that they had been offered $10 to $15 to engage in this campaign. They were supposed to make certain posts with certain hashtags, certain pictures at certain times. They all apparently had multiple automated accounts to engage in this campaign. Madung states that hundreds of accounts posting under those hashtags showcased suspicious activity that seemed to show bot behavior, essentially. And when he gave these findings to Twitter, they subsequently suspended 240 accounts. Many of the posts, hashtags, and memes propped up and spoke favorably of N. Kyoko, who coincidentally happens to be CitizenGo's campaign director for Africa. In his report, Madung cites another example of the manipulation of the public in Africa, which I think is very important to hear, to get a firmer grasp on what these campaigns strive to achieve. Kenya is not the only place Twitter's trending algorithm has allowed for manipulation by external entities. In South Africa, now disgraced and defunct London-based public relations company Bell Pottinger took on a notorious client in 2016 that was the catalyst for its demise. In January of that year, the firm met with the owners of Oak Bay Investments, Ajay Atul and Tony Gupta, a family accused of corrupt dealings under the leadership of then-President Jacob Zuma. Also at the meeting was Duduzane Zuma, the former president's son. According to leaked documents, Duduzane and the Guptas briefed Bell Pottinger to run a campaign that targeted at, quote, grassroots South Africans. The idea was to direct attention away from alleged state capture by the Gupta family by distracting the largely marginalized black population and stirring up conversations about, quote, economic apartheid in the country since the advent of democracy in 1994. It was found that Bell Pottinger's campaign infiltrated a mixed bag of communication streams, including Twitter. White monopoly capital became the most popular phrase, synonymous with the campaign. It was reported that over 100 fake accounts shared over 220,000 tweets, with some of the most popular hashtags being hashtag white monopoly capital and hashtag respect Guptas. The coordinated attack was intended to unite South Africans against a common enemy, which these bots said was white-owned businesses and not the Guptas, whose reputation the campaign sought to sanitize. While the campaign blew up in the faces of the Guptas, Bell Pottinger and Jacob Zuma, it cannot be denied that it was effective in sowing the seeds of racial tension in the country. Cases like this show that the trending algorithm is far too easy to manipulate by bad actors seeking to drive conversation. He further points out that the fact that Anne Kyoko is a black African woman is very important to the success of these campaigns. The fact that she isn't a white lord allows CitizenGo to manipulate the public's justified disdain for colonialism to achieve their own goals. It allows them to tap into widely held and justified cultural traumata with phrasing such as labeling reproductive health, quote, cultural imperialism and ideological colonization, and the West pushing its agenda on us, while simultaneously obfuscating the fact that these people and their funders are the whitest motherfuckers this continent has to offer. It also allows them to evade or make accusations of them undertaking colonial enterprises less effective, since they use the phrasing first. Responding to them, well, actually, I think you guys are doing something pretty colonialism-like. It just sounds like saying, I know you are, but what am I? It sounds dumb and childish. Next thing of what they're funding, what we unfortunately need to talk about, is super PACs and echo chambers. Hasdor or CitizenGo, I use them relatively interchangeably in this video, although they are not exactly the same thing, but you know, same guys behind them, just saying. They've been labeled a super PAC for far-right parties in Europe by multiple people. According to Arsuaga himself, while donations to political parties are limited, donations to his organization are not. He has also stated that he has extensive links to Fidesz in Hungary, Lega in Italy, Vox in Spain, and some contact to the AfD in Germany. While they organize with Spain's far-right party Vox and remaining formally distinct entities, this allows both sides to essentially circumvent political donation laws. At the very least, they had planned to run anti-advertisements according to open democracy. Instead of coming out in support of one party, they instead try to and seek to disparage their rivals. While I'm not aware of any campaigns that have been directly linked to CitizenGo, we have seen this form of anti-advertising a lot more in recent years. At least that's my impression. One way you could go about it is, for example, to design a political poster kind of in a style that is at least reminiscent of the party you're trying to campaign against, and then put on disparaging keywords, I guess, like terroristic or oppressive. You know, this party is supported by George Soros, things like that. You know, along the lines of, like, this is this horrible thing and they want that. So maybe don't vote for them. Maybe vote for us instead. Sometimes the last bit isn't made explicit. Even without those kind of direct endorsements, supposedly apolitical campaigns serve to further the power these parties hold. If abortion is this terrible evil that, you know, we have convinced you of, and we just hang up a poster of, you know, Party X and Party Y support abortion, maybe that's all that needs to be said. Now, if you live in the US or have lived in the US for some time, I suppose this just seems like business as usual to you, and, you know, God bless your soul. But in Europe, a lot of people and commentators and academics feel like this is genuinely unprecedented for the political landscape here. Personally, I wouldn't say that that is necessarily true in every aspect, but I too am under the impression that the nature of these campaigns, their intensity and their frequency has increased. Aside from striving towards and pushing to get certain parties into power, once those parties or people are in power, these organizations also serve as what data calls government echo chambers. Here's a longer quote, but again, very important to hear. Some anti-gender actors have become useful allies for illiberal governments and have consequently been rewarded with public funding to echo official propaganda. The best examples come from Poland, with the Fundacja Lux Veritatis and the TFP-affiliated Ordo Iuris, and Hungary, with several entities within the orbit of Prime Minister Orban and the Fidesz party. In Poland, the two main mechanisms for the state to support domestic civil society are the NIW, the National Freedom Institute, and the KIPR, Confederation of Non-Governmental Initiatives of the Republic. Ordo Iuris and related TFP satellite organizations have secured key positions within both the NIW and the KIPR. In May 2021, Oko Press reported how Timotheus Zich, the deputy head of Ordo Iuris, had served on the board of the NIW since 2018, which in turn had awarded public contracts totaling several million euros to TFP-related entities, where Zich and other Ordo Iuris affiliated persons served on the governance bodies. Ordo is the fund manager of KIPR, which serves as an alternative forum of Polish NGOs, focusing on, quote, patriotism, community, sovereignty, freedom, civil society, and family. The Polish government is thus able to channel funds directly to friendly NGOs and away from women's groups, human rights defenders, or LGBTQI organizations. In May 2021, Paweł Kwasniak, The former head of TFP-affiliated Caesar had been named director of KIPR and stated, quote, "We must ensure that conservative values such as family and patriotism are the foundation of public authorities and the natural point of reference for as much of society as possible." While Ordo Juris itself claims not to benefit from government funding, as the KIPR fund manager, it can direct funding to like-minded organizations, including its satellite organizations. In Hungary, a coterie of oligarchs has emerged over the past decade to support the Fidesz party, and Prime Minister Orban and, quote, "much of the new Fidesz-linked business elite has achieved its success primarily through state contracts, about 60% of which are funded by the EU. These oligarchs include Dorin Mészáros, reputed to be Hungary's wealthiest man, with a fortune estimated at $1.3 billion, as well as Lajos Simiska, István Garancsesi, and István Tibors, who are collectively known as the MGTS Plus group of crony businessmen close to the Fidesz party. In 2020, the Budapest-based Corruption Research Center Budapest released a report demonstrating that the, quote, "corruption risk in Hungarian public procurement reached its highest level since 2005. By April 30, 41% of the contracts were awarded without any competition. The MGTS Plus group won 74 public procurements this year worth $84 million, 68% without any competition. Their wins represented 27% of the net value of all government contracts. The MGTS Plus, which is arguably the more cursed of the plus acronym groups, you know what I mean. The MGTS Plus are all personally close to the Prime Minister and his family, and owing their fortunes to the Prime Minister, they have then taken up roles in advancing state-sponsored anti-gender narratives through the media channels they control. In my opinion, remaining formally distinct from governmental bodies allows some private actors that are close to the people who are in government to not only enrich themselves through public funding, but also allows the government to be a little more sneaky about the fact that what is being served to the people is actually just state-sanctioned propaganda and nothing more. It's a mutually benefit situation for both sides involved. The people in power can increase their power, the private actors supporting them can increase their wealth. And vice versa. You know, the people in power are also increasing their wealth, and the private people are also increasing their power. These state-sanctioned NGOs, in research usually referred to as government-organized, non-governmental organizations, and yes, I know that's oxymoronic, everybody knows that, serve the important function of organized, illusionary, and therefore controllable dissent in an illiberal, autocratic regime. Whether it's a democracy or a dictatorship doesn't really matter at that point, in my opinion, of course. It allows them, as well as their trustees, to plunder a nation with less disturbance. They're killing us with our money. Very anticlimactic after the last sentence, but it's something I also want to mention, and I have no idea where else to put it, okay? So CitizenGo also organizes with some of their funds what they refer to as summer schools. And at these summer schools, people for a fee can attend all kinds of seminars organized by them. They fly in all kinds of propagandists so that, I guess, young up-and-comers can learn the ins and outs of propaganda, networking, and funding. And the event itself is, of course, also a networking opportunity. Now, the godfather of such events is, without a doubt, the WCF, which Brian Brown is a part of, and was seemingly involved in Russia's and Ghana's anti-LGBTQ legislation. And I mention this because, in my opinion, these networking events play, in my opinion, an integral role in the rise of the extremist right in the last couple of years. I think they are good at and achieving something that we as lefties at this point in time can only dream of, which is international organizing. These people have the resources to actually internationally organize, and I think that plays a huge role in being relatively successful in anything. And I also think that it's a little dangerous and a little naive to just brush this international aspect, which in my opinion is the most important part of this rise, to just push it aside or not really push that aspect more into public conscious. Now, we've talked about the who, we've talked about the what. Now, the last remaining question is, of course, the why. Why are they doing this? The first thing we have to acknowledge is that the most of these organizations benefit from tax exemptions or tax benefits. While CitizenGo's tax beneficial status was revoked in 2019, these tax-exempt organizations allowed the rich to funnel the income that otherwise would be taxed to, I don't know, build hospitals or schools or some other stupid shit like that, into structures and organizations that they think will further their wealth and power, while the organizations themselves usually present themselves as being about civil rights, or rather abolishing said rights. All of the parties that benefit from them, and sometimes they are associated with, push for a merciless, pro-wealth, pro-corporate agenda. But why reproductive health, abortion, and LGBTQ rights? After all, the evergreen of making the third of hyper-libertarian, pro-wealth bullshit palatable to the masses is racism, especially in Europe and North America. And while all of the related parties in Europe are, without a doubt, racist, the organizations themselves usually only talk about or mention racism in order to say, actually, it is the left that is racist. Why is that? Well, in my opinion, it is because, as I've alluded to, they seek to act globally. And hijacking countries outside of Europe or North America is probably a little harder when you publicly say that the people who support you want are actually subhumans, you know? I think them talking about how pushing for reproductive health rights is Western imperialism or colonialism is an exploitation of anti-racist and anti-colonialist sentiments. They use the aesthetic of anti-racism and anti-colonialism to appeal to the populations of nations who historically have suffered under the implications of racism and colonialism. They manipulate and exploit these traumata. I think that both outwards, so towards the rest of the world, as well as inwards, so the continents or countries they originate from, they seek to distinguish themselves from this ideological construct of the West? In our words, what can we propagate to be an alternative to the West? What are we what the West is not? How can we distinguish ourselves? And I think this particular strand of motivation actually has no real regard for the actual implications, meanings, and consequences of what they're arguing for, advocating for. It's marketing. And I know that sounds cruel, but that's because it is. However, I also want to strongly emphasize that while I make these broad generalizations in order to be able to approach the topic at all, all of the people involved are individuals and have individual motivations for what they're doing. Very often these motivations will probably never be known to us, only to themselves and the people close to them. But I really want to caution people in general against dehumanizing people into this nebulous conglomerate that kind of pulls the strings behind the scenes and things like that. Another reason for the focus on these topics is, well, what else do these organizations have in common with one another? Nothing. What interest could the Vatican possibly have in strengthening the aristocrats in Germany or Austria? What interest could these aristocrats possibly have in strengthening the Russian Orthodox Church? What interest could some shrewd businessman have in promoting the interests of these other groups? None. The motivations and reasons are manifold, not only because we are still dealing with individuals, but also these individuals have different affiliations under these bigger groups. Some is old money, some is new money, some are monarchists, some are fascists, some are libertarians, some are strongly religious, some others not so much. And promoting the hatred of queer people or the subjugation of women is the only thing they have in common. It's the only thing they can agree on. So once again, they can unify behind a common enemy. And that is the only thing that they can unify against. They have nothing in common except for their hatred. The last disclaimer I feel like I have to make is that I generally believe that the rationalization of these things happening with the rich just want to get richer tends to be a gross oversimplification. During the Weimar Republic, the German Communist Party was very convinced that the NSDAP actually just promotes anti-Semitism to be more appealing to the people, just for marketing essentially, and that their true intentions was just regular old capitalism. And while I don't think that that's entirely untrue, turns out they were also just violently anti-Semitic without additional ulterior motives needed. Worker solidarity means to not naively assume that at worst all of these efforts, well, they're just gonna result in more capitalism. Because for many workers, it will result in much, much worse. Solidarity means to take this seriously. To take it seriously, that lives are not only being starved, but concretely threatened.